A little boy quietly entered the hair salon with his father. No one could have guessed that just a few minutes later, the hairdresser would be the one to save his life. The wound on the back of his neck was not just an infection. It was evidence of a silence that had lasted far too long. And from that moment on, everything began to change. The soft jingle of a bell echoed as the glass door of Grace's hair studio swung open from the inside. That was how mornings in Willow Creek began. Gentle sounds drifting into the chilly air, echoing through the quiet streets. A thin mist hovered above the old, red-tiled rooftops, while a light breeze whispered through the aging maple trees on the porches. The smell of toasted bread from the bakery at the corner mingled with the rich aroma of early morning coffee, creating a serene, faraway stillness. Grace Walker switched on the lights at exactly 6:42 in the morning, earlier than usual. The night before, she had dreamed of her mother gently detangling her hair by the window. When she woke up, there was an unshakable emptiness in her chest she couldn't quite name. She brewed a pot of strong coffee, unlocked the shop door, and began wiping each pane of glass like it was part of a sacred ritual. Everything in the small salon was tidy, yet she still sterilized her scissors again. Her hands moved over each item as if touching a folded memory. Grace's hair studio wasn't big, but it was an irreplaceable piece of memory for the locals. The salon chairs were old but polished to a shine, and the walls were decorated with posters of 90s hairstyles, alongside a few hand-drawn sketches from the daughter of the neighboring store owner. Shiny scissors lay neatly in an aluminum tray, and the pristine white capes were folded perfectly, as if waiting for something more sacred than just another haircut. Around 7:30, the doorbell chimed again. Grace looked up, smiling reflexively, but her expression froze when she saw who stepped inside. It was Samuel Bennett, a man in his 40s, tall and thin, wearing a worn-out gray coat, his shoulders slightly hunched, and a face that was blank and cold. Beside him stood a frail little boy, about 8 years old, with hollow eyes, pale skin, and sleeves so long they nearly swallowed his small clenched hands. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett. Noah, I'm glad you came in today." Grace adjusted her tone to stay gently polite, neither too familiar nor too distant. The boy only nodded slightly, without looking at her. His steps dragged, like he was forcing himself toward the salon chair in the middle of the shop. Samuel pointed. "Short, clean cut in the back. Don't let it cover his eyes." Grace nodded, glancing subtly at Noah as he climbed onto the chair, his legs dangling above the floor. She bent down a little, her voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for him to hear. "Do you want some orange juice? It's cold, I just put it in the fridge this morning." He shook his head. His small hands rested on his lap, but his fingers curled nervously inward. His nails were jagged with red, irritated cuticles. Grace draped a white robe around his shoulders. When her hand touched him, he flinched slightly. It wasn't a big reaction, but it was noticeable, like a small creature's reflex to be startled after living too long in silence. She touched it gently, reminding herself not to rush. Noah's hair was long, thin, and greasy. Some of it was tangled, clumpy, and a few strands looked dusty. Grace was surprised, not by the length, but by the fact that it had clearly been like that for days. "Noah, with hair like this, you're going to break a lot of little girls' hearts," Grace tried to joke. She didn't expect a response, just wanted to ease the heavy atmosphere. The boy didn't smile. His head hung low, eyes fixed on a small scuff on the tiled floor, the only thing anchoring him to the room. His shoulders tensed, his whole body drawn in as if trying to become invisible in the brightly lit space. It felt like he wasn't truly present, just a shell, a forced presence without choice. Grace paused, looking closer. His nails were peeling, with scratch marks and dry flaking skin around his knuckles. Dark circles ringed his eyes. His skin was dull. The thin coat on him was wrinkled, stained near the cuffs. Samuel still stood behind them, eyes glued to his phone, oblivious to everything happening. Grace took a deep breath. In that brief moment, she sensed something was wrong, not obvious, but real. Noah didn't look like a child who was loved. He looked like someone learning how to survive in absence. She made another cut, carefully. Every time the scissors touched his hair, she watched his face. No reaction, no discomfort, no fear, but no sign of life either. The silence stretched so long, Grace could hear the faint drip of coffee behind the counter. She asked gently, almost to herself, "How old are you, Noah?" 8. His voice was barely audible. "What grade are you in?" "Third." Even softer this time. Grace nodded. "Do you have a best friend in class?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Has anyone ever told you you're good at drawing?" He didn't answer, but his shoulder twitched. Grace couldn't tell if it was emotion or just a shiver. She was about to say something else when Samuel looked up, voice blunt. "Almost done? I've got places to be." Grace didn't reply. Her eyes were fixed on the left side of Noah's face, where light from the window cast across his pale skin. A faint red mark, maybe a scratch or something else, quieter and far more concerning. An uneasy wave swept through her chest like a cold ripple crawling up her spine. She wanted to ask, she wanted to stop everything, but instead, she exhaled softly, her hands steady with the next cut, trying to calm herself. Not now. Noah needed peace. He needed space to breathe in a room without judgment. Questions could wait. Kindness could not. Grace continued cutting, slowly, as if trying to hold on to something fragile. Her heart was uneasy, but she knew, with children like Noah, rushing was the easiest way to break them. And she had a feeling today would not end like any other ordinary day. The clinking sound of scissors echoed softly inside the salon, a familiar rhythm amidst the heavy stillness scented with soap, antiseptic, and stale coffee. Grace Walker stood behind the swivel chair, her hands gently resting on the shoulders of the little boy whose name she had just learned, Noah. His eyes remained fixed on a tile on the floor. There was nothing unusual in the way he sat, but it was the absolute silence that unsettled Grace. "Are you feeling okay?" she asked quietly, not expecting an answer, only hoping for a sign that the boy was truly present. Noah gave a faint nod, almost mechanical. His face was pale, dark circles under his eyes, hair nearly covering his ears. He could have been any 8-year-old in the neighborhood, but something was wrong. Grace had sensed it the moment she draped the cape over his shoulders. She began to trim his hair like she would any other day, but when she ran her fingers through the back of his head to brush the hair aside, she froze. The skin underneath was swollen, inflamed, hidden beneath tangled strands. Tiny cracks in the blistered area oozed pale yellow fluid, and a faint, foul odor lingered in the air. She set down her scissors and gently lifted more of the hair. The boy didn't flinch, didn't cry, only trembled slightly. "Does it hurt, Noah?" Grace asked, her voice carefully hushed so as not to disturb the tension in the room. He didn't look up. He just shook his head, lips pressed tightly together, as if releasing them might let something out he couldn't control. Grace knelt to his level, wiped her hands, and gently touched the back of his hand. His small fingers were thin, the skin peeling. His nails were bitten to the quick, some spots even bloody. She didn't need to ask to know he had been hiding this discomfort for a long time. "Do you scratch it a lot?" What seemed like a simple question made the boy hesitate. After a moment, Noah nodded slightly. "Does your dad know?" This time, the boy raised his eyes just a little, looking at her through damp lashes. His voice was barely audible. "He said if I cry or say it hurts, I'll get punished." Grace felt her heart tighten, not just because of what he said, but because of how he said it. Gently, naturally, like it was something a child was simply expected to accept. Behind them, Samuel Bennett remained seated in the waiting area, one leg crossed over the other, eyes locked on his phone screen. Not once had he looked at his son. Not once had he acknowledged the quiet conversation happening just feet away. Grace stood up, took a deep breath, and walked toward him. "Mr. Bennett, I just found a serious sore on the back of your son's neck. I strongly suggest you take him to see a doctor immediately." Samuel didn't look at her, only lifted his chin slightly and replied curtly, "I know. He scratches a lot. I put ointment on it." "This isn't new. It's infected and filled with pus," Grace said, her voice steady and deliberate. Only then did Samuel lower his phone and glance at her, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Who do you think you are? I came here for a haircut, not a lecture." Grace kept her composure, though inside her anger surged like a rising tide, not because of the insult, but because of the cold indifference toward a child, clearly in pain. "As an adult, I can't look away," she replied, "especially when the child over there is too afraid to speak." The atmosphere in the salon felt like someone had just turned off the music. At that moment, the doorbell chimed again. An elderly woman, Antonia Cruz, stepped in. She paused at the entrance, sensing the tension immediately. "Grace?" she said, her eyes drifting to Noah. "That boy doesn't look well." Grace nodded without speaking. Antonia's gaze moved from Samuel to the silent child in the chair. Grace turned back to Noah. He was sitting upright, hands clenched beneath the cape. He didn't dare turn his head, just stared straight ahead into the mirror, where a pale, worn face reflected back, one that didn't belong on any 8-year-old. Grace quietly reached into her pocket, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed out a brief message. Suspected child abandonment. Grace's hair studio, Willow Street. She sent it to the one person she trusted to intervene, Captain Ryan McConnell. She set her phone on the counter and looked up, locking eyes with Noah through the mirror. No words passed between them, but in his eyes was a vast silence, as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to truly notice. Grace looked at the mirror one more time. 3 reflections stared back at her. A man turned away, a child who had learned to survive by staying silent, and a woman just beginning to realize that sometimes speaking up isn't just courage, it's salvation. Early morning sunlight streamed through the fogged-up glass windows of the small hair salon on the corner of Willow Creek. The air still carried the scent of herbal shampoo Grace had just used to clean the wash basin, mixed with the low hum of the radio playing old country songs. Everything seemed to move along its usual rhythm until the doorbell rang, sharp and clear. Captain Ryan McConnell pushed the door open, letting in a rush of cold air into the warm shop. He wore a deep navy police coat, his boots still dusted with road grit. No one in the salon spoke, but all eyes turned to him. Ryan didn't look around. He walked directly to the front counter where Grace was already standing, gaze steady and waiting. When their eyes met, no words were spoken, but an unspoken understanding passed between them. Grace didn't ask anything. She simply tilted her head slightly toward the center chair where little Noah was curled up, as if he wanted to disappear inside his oversized coat. "Good morning, Troy. Can we talk for a moment?" Ryan said, his voice low and calm, but every word clear. Troy Bennett looked up from his phone. He scowled when he recognized Ryan, then gave a tight, annoyed smile. "What is this about? I'm just getting my kid a haircut. Since when does that need police interference?" Ryan remained silent. His eyes grew sharper as he stepped closer to the chair where Noah sat. The boy was tiny, shrinking into himself, hands clutched tightly at the hem of his coat. Grace stood close, worry clouding her face. She gently placed her hand on Noah's shoulder, not to restrain, just to let him know he wasn't alone anymore. "Noah, sweetheart, are you feeling okay? Does anything hurt or feel uncomfortable?" Ryan knelt slightly, his tone warm and soothing, careful not to startle the boy. Noah shook his head softly, but his eyes turned to Grace, as if looking for permission. Grace gave a barely there nod, as if saying, "You can trust him." Grace gently lifted the messy hair at the back of Noah's neck. Under the overhead light, a swollen red wound came into full view, ringed with yellowish pus and flaking skin. A faint, foul smell rose up, making Ryan inhale deeply through his nose. His brows furrowed, his expression heavy, as though he was staring at something that couldn't be ignored. "How long has this wound been there, Troy?" "I told you already, it's just a rash. Kids scratch themselves all the time. You don't need to blow this out of proportion," Troy replied, his voice rising in irritation, eyes darting away. Ryan didn't speak. He slowly stood up and gestured for Grace to step back. His eyes remained locked on the boy in front of him, watching every tiny movement as if it were a silent alarm. The air in the salon suddenly thickened. All background noise seemed to vanish. Noah's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders rising and falling with short, shallow breaths. His little hands clutched each other, now visibly trembling. Then, like a kite with a cut string, the boy swayed forward. "Noah?" Grace called softly, reaching to catch him, but the child collapsed into her arms, sweat pouring from his forehead. His frail body trembled lightly, as though even the gentlest breeze would knock him down. Grace instinctively wrapped her arms around him, whispering, "It's okay. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." "You're all making a big deal over nothing," Troy shouted, his voice sharper than usual. "It's just a little sore. Kids get scrapes, for God's sake. I put ointment on it. Obviously, I've been taking care of him." "I'm requesting an ambulance right now," Ryan said as he pulled out his phone. Grace looked up, her eyes shining with a fierceness even she hadn't realized she had. "I'm going with him. I won't let this boy be alone." Troy stormed forward, pointing a finger at her. "You're nobody. You're not his mother. You're not even family. What gives you the right?" Grace didn't move. She stood up slowly, still holding Noah's limp body in her arms, never breaking eye contact with Troy. "You forgot how to be a father a long time ago." The room fell into a frozen silence. Mrs. Antonia Cruz, who had been hiding behind the curtain, stood stunned. She pressed a hand to her chest, as if her heart had just been crushed by a truth too cruel to bear. Minutes later, the wail of an ambulance siren echoed down the street. The salon door flew open again as 2 EMTs stepped in with a stretcher and medical kit. One of them was Emily Hayes, who often worked the night shift at the nearby hospital. "How old is the boy?" Emily asked quickly. 8. "High fever, semi-conscious, and severe skin infection at the neck," Ryan answered. Grace carefully handed Noah to them but kept holding his hand tightly. "I'm going with him," she said firmly, not waiting for approval. Emily looked at her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's go." Ryan turned to Troy. "You'll need to stay here and provide a statement. From now on, everything will be investigated thoroughly." Troy stood stiffly, jaw clenched, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Grace didn't look back. She simply sat beside Noah in the ambulance as it pulled away from the narrow street, carrying a quiet little boy who needed saving and a woman who had once just been a hairdresser but had now become his first line of defense. The wind chime above the salon door rang once more, this time sounding like a sigh. The emergency vehicle's lights flickered continuously, red and amber flashes, casting erratic shadows on the white ceiling above the nurse's head. The siren's wail pulsed through the early morning fog, echoing like a distant warning, stirring something deep in the memory. Outside, the sky above Willow Creek hadn't fully brightened, and the streets lay eerily empty, as if holding their breath before the storm of what was to come. Grace Walker sat beside the stretcher, her hands clasping tightly around the small, cold hand of Noah Bennett. The boy lay there, eyes shut tight, his face ghostly pale as though even the blood in his body had retreated. His hair was sweat-matted and tangled, his skin nearly translucent under the pulsing red light. Emily Hayes, the nurse on early shift, adjusted the oxygen line with focused hands, her eyes occasionally glancing toward Grace with quiet empathy. Beside them, the heart monitor ticked out lonely beeps. Each sound stretched the silence taut, underscoring every passing second of unease. No one spoke loudly, no one moved unnecessarily. The air inside the ambulance had thickened with the fragility of life. "He's running a very high fever. The skin around the wound has started to show signs of necrosis," Emily said in a whisper, as if speaking to a soul on the brink. "We'll try to get the infection under control as soon as we reach the hospital. He just needs a few more hours." Grace didn't answer. She only tightened her hold on Noah's hand. Her thumb gently ran across the bony ridges of his fingers. His skin was rough, fingernails cracked and peeling. Faint red welts circled his wrists, maybe from scratching in his sleep. She didn't want to imagine the nights he had woken alone, burning with fever and fear, clawing at himself with no one there to comfort him. Noah let out a faint whimper. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, barely forming words. Grace leaned down, her hand gently pressing his. In his delirium, his voice came out broken, barely audible. "I'm sorry. My hair's dirty. I shouldn't have let it get like that. I didn't want you to touch it." Grace choked back a sob, tears slipping silently under the back of his hand. She placed her other hand on his forehead, which burned like a dying ember. "No, Noah. It's not your fault. You don't have to apologize for hurting. No one has the right to make you feel sorry for being sick." Her voice cracked, dissolving into a heavy breath. She stroked his hair gently, feeling each brittle strand. Sometimes a single gesture like that could become a vow. I'm here. I won't let anyone make you suffer like this again. I promise." Emily returned, gently laying a thin blanket over the boy. She checked the vital signs and adjusted the IV flow. Then, almost to herself, she murmured, "Some kids grow up thinking every problem is their fault. They believe if they stay quiet, they'll be loved. If they don't complain, they'll be allowed to stay. But really, no one ever taught them that it's okay to be vulnerable." Grace didn't respond immediately. Her eyes were fixed on the rear window, where the city passed by slowly, like pieces of memory drifting through mist and blurred sound. "I was one of those kids too," Grace said softly, like peeling back a part of herself she rarely revealed. "After my mom died, I was sent to live with an aunt. She wasn't cruel, but she never hugged me either. No comforting words. I was taught to cook, to clean, and most of all, to be quiet and obedient. I learned how to bandage my own wounds, to cry silently in the dark, and to never ask for anything. I believed that if I was good enough, if I endured enough, I wouldn't be abandoned again." Emily listened without interrupting. She understood that kind of silence, the kind that lets a child grow up invisible, unheld, unasked. "I didn't have anyone when I needed someone most," Grace continued. "But Noah won't grow up like that, not alone, not in silence, not the way I did." In that moment, Emily turned slightly away, pretending to check the IV line, not to avoid the words, but to keep Grace from seeing her own eyes glistening. The ambulance slowed, turning into the hospital lot. Bright white hallway lights sliced through the early dawn gloom. Figures in white coats moved past the rear window. A doctor waved. The back doors began to open. Grace leaned down and brushed her lips gently against Noah's forehead. She whispered, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "We're here. I'm with you. I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time, even if just for a second, his small hand squeezed hers in return. A weak yet sincere sign. Grace held on to that tiny movement as something sacred, as if the boy was saying, with every ounce of strength he had left, "I believe you." The doors swung open, and the sterile hospital light rushed in. A team of doctors and nurses approached, rolling the stretcher inside. Emily rattled off medical jargon while Grace followed close, her eyes never leaving Noah. Footsteps echoed against the tile floor, the stretcher wheels rolling like a tense melody. The hallway was still quiet, everything seeming to slow. Grace saw pictures on the walls, smiling children holding balloons. She wished with all her heart that one day Noah would smile like that too. Right then, he moved his lips again. Grace leaned close. "Am I a bother?" Grace's throat tightened. "No, you're not a bother. You never were." And she knew, no matter how long the road ahead might be, that moment when a hurting child asks whether he's allowed to exist was the reason she couldn't walk away. Noah was no longer just a case. He was the reason Grace had become a better person. And for the first time in her life, she realized that being trusted by someone, especially a child, was enough to turn an ordinary woman into a hero without a cape. The fluorescent lights cast pale patches onto the white tile floor, flickering like the cold, fragmented feeling that had settled throughout the hospital hallway. These beams of light were unstable, broken up by the passing shadows of hurried footsteps, the creaking of stretcher wheels, and the soft sighs of nurses working the night shift. It felt as if the building itself had learned to survive in silence, where overwhelming emotions had long since hardened into routine. At the end of the corridor, an automatic door slowly closed with a faint whoosh, like a quiet exhale from walls that had witnessed too much. The hospital never truly slept. Even in the deep hours of night, it remained alive, quiet and persistent, like a body that never stopped working. In the stillness, every sound became more vivid. The rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, the faint clinking of metal, the wind whispering through cracked window frames. Inside room 214, the air was thick with the sterile scent of antiseptic, mixed with traces of lingering anesthesia. The overhead light wasn't harsh, but just bright enough to make every detail visible. A slightly wrinkled privacy curtain, the soft blinking of an IV machine, and neatly wrapped bandages in a stainless steel tray resting on a side table. On the hospital bed, young Noah Bennett lay motionless, his small body cocooned in white sheets. His head was wrapped in gauze, with only one flushed cheek peeking through, warm from the fever. He didn't seem to be dreaming or resisting or yearning. He simply lay there, as if even he wasn't sure he was allowed to exist in this space. Beside him, Grace Walker sat silently, her hands clasped together, her eyes fixed on the monitor, blinking steadily. Each beep seemed to receive a small nod from her, as if it confirmed Noah was still there. She hadn't spoken in hours. She'd lost count of how long they'd been in the hospital. Time here wasn't measured by clocks, but by breaths. "The infection has spread significantly," Dr. Michael Grayson said, his voice low and clinical, yet not without warmth. He studied the monitor and the latest scan results, his brow furrowing. "We're on the edge of the window. If we don't control it within the next 24 hours, the risk of sepsis becomes extremely high." To be honest, the boy is still fighting, but his body's completely exhausted after going so long without proper care. Dr. Evelyn Brooks, whose sharp eyes were softened by compassion, nodded slowly. Her gaze lingered over the red, swollen tissue at the back of Noah's neck. "We've already started him on a high-dose, broad-spectrum antibiotic, but his body hasn't shown a clear response yet. The inflammation is spreading quickly, and his immune system is weakening by the hour. We'll continue close monitoring, but I have to admit, anything could happen." Grace didn't turn her head, just gave a small nod and said, "I'm staying." Nurse Emily Hayes, the night shift nurse, stood quietly beside her. She gently placed a hand on Grace's shoulder and whispered, "If anyone asks, I'll say your family. What this place needs isn't more paperwork, it needs more kindness." Dr. Grayson exchanged a few final notes with Dr. Brooks, scribbled some instructions in his file, then the two doctors left the room. The door shut with a soft click, barely making a sound. The silence returned, broken only by the pulse of the heart monitor and Noah's shallow breaths. The boy stirred slightly, his brow furrowing in his sleep, but he didn't wait. Grace stood, adjusted the blanket around him, and gently stroked his hair where it wasn't bandaged. She looked down at his fragile face, his lips pressed tight, his flushed cheek peeking out from the wrappings. "You don't have to smile when you're in pain, okay? No one here expects you to pretend to be okay." Out in the hallway, Captain Ryan McConnell leaned against the wall, a thick case file in his hand. He flipped through the pages as if searching for some piece of information that might change everything. His expression was grave. When Grace stepped out, she closed the door behind her with quiet care. "I've signed the order to detain Troy Bennett," Ryan said, his voice firm and resolute. "He's not allowed any contact with Noah for now. Child Protective Services has been notified, and they'll begin their investigation first thing tomorrow morning." Grace exhaled slowly. "Did you find any other family for him?" "There may be an aunt," Ryan replied. "Lives in Oak Ridge, Montana. I've got our admin team trying to verify the details, but they haven't spoken in years. It's unclear if there's still any meaningful connection." Grace nodded, her eyes drifting towards some distant point down the hall, as if calculating the emotional distance they still had to travel. She didn't ask anything more, but her expression made a quiet promise. If no one else showed up, she would stay by this boy's side. Ryan watched her for a long moment, then spoke gently. "I know you're doing more than anyone expects." Grace didn't hesitate. "That's exactly why I have to do it, because no one expects it." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. Their presence in that long, cold hallway in the middle of the night meant more than any conversation could. On her way back, Grace paused at the nurse's station. A young nurse with dark circles under her eyes was filling out paperwork. When she saw Grace, she smiled faintly. "That boy, he has the same eyes as so many kids I've met. Doesn't cry, doesn't resist, just goes quiet bit by bit." Grace nodded. "It's like he locked himself in, and no one gave him the key." The nurse looked down, her voice barely audible. "But you gave it to him, somehow." Grace didn't respond. She walked back into the room, closed the door behind her, and pulled her chair a little closer to the bed. From her pocket, she took out a small comb and gently began brushing the part of Noah's hair that wasn't wrapped in bandages. She did it as if he were her own son, as if each stroke were a quiet vow. "I'm here." That night, Grace stayed by Noah's side without sleeping. She didn't need a title in the hospital's records. She didn't need an official role or recognized relationship. For Noah, she was simply the one who stayed when everyone else chose to walk away. Outside the hospital window, the streetlights flickered gently in the thin mist that blanketed the courtyard. A stray cat padded across the grass, pausing beneath a maple tree and lifting its head toward the glowing windows of the upper hospital floors. Every movement in the night felt small, as though the world had pulled itself inward to listen to the fragile breaths of those still trying to hold on. In room 214, Grace sat beside Noah's bed. The wall clock ticked softly, while the warm glow from the bedside lamp cast a soft halo over the white pillow. She had carefully folded the blanket at the foot of the bed. Though Noah hadn't fully regained consciousness, his tiny hand had stopped trembling. Grace gently folded his worn hospital gown, her fingers brushing over each crease as if tending to something more delicate than silk. On the bedside table lay a children's book, its cover frayed at the edges. She had been reading to him since early evening, her voice slow and steady, as if each word were a small boat carrying his soul across a fevered storm. Though Noah hadn't opened his eyes even once, she kept reading, quietly reminding him that someone was waiting for him to come back. Emily walked in gently, carrying the faint scent of antiseptic and instant coffee. "It's getting chilly tonight. You should put this on to keep warm," she said, handing Grace a thin beige coat. Wrinkled but still warm, Grace offered a small smile. "Thank you." Emily hesitated for a moment before whispering, "If anyone asks, I'll say your family." Grace didn't respond right away. She looked at Noah, who was still sleeping, his breath shallow but even. The soft white light illuminated his pale, thin cheeks. She clutched the coat tightly in her hands. "Do you think anyone will really come for him?" Emily didn't answer. She simply held Grace's gaze for a long moment, then quietly stepped out of the room. As she closed the door behind her, she did it so gently it made no sound. The hallway stretched long and dim behind her, lined with flickering nightlights outside each emergency room. At the Willow Creek Police Department, Captain Ryan McConnell sat at his desk, the glow from his computer screen reflecting off his smudged glasses. Behind him stood Detective Rachel Monroe and Detective Marcus Lane, silent and still. Each keystroke felt like a racing heartbeat, digging up old records, placing fragile hopes on the line. "Her name is Carolyn Bennett, Samuel's sister," Ryan said in a low voice. "She's currently living in Oak Ridge, Montana. According to the system, the address is still valid." Rachel sighed. "You going to call?" Ryan nodded. He picked up the desk phone and dialed. Someone picked up after the third ring. "Hello?" came a woman's voice, trembling and cautious, as though no one had called her this late in years. "I'm sorry to bother you at this hour," Ryan said gently, trying to keep his voice steady. "This is Captain McConnell from the Willow Creek Police Department. I'm calling about a child named Noah Bennett. Are you Carolyn Bennett?" There was a long silence on the other end. Then her voice cracked like a guitar string pulled too tight. Is he alive? Is he okay?" Ryan sat up straighter. "He's been taken to the hospital. His condition is serious, but he's receiving care. We need to know if you're able to." "I'll come," she said, her voice choked. "I'll take the earliest bus tonight. Please tell him I never stopped thinking about him." "I will," Ryan replied softly. "Thank you, Carolyn." When he hung up, Rachel had turned away, her eyes shimmering. Marcus quietly jotted something down in his notebook. The hum of the office's air conditioner filled the silence like a long, tired exhale. In the interrogation room, Samuel Bennett sat with his head bowed, his calloused hands locked together, as if trying to hold on to something slipping away. The dim yellow light cast a dull haze over his graying hair. Behind the one-way glass, Ryan and Rachel watched in silence. The room was cold, but sweat glistened on Samuel's forehead. His metal chair creaked every time he shifted. Rachel stepped inside, holding a thick folder. She didn't open it. She sat across from him and placed the file softly on the table. "Can you tell me again," she said, "what you believe you did right?" Samuel didn't lift his head. "I didn't hit him. I didn't hurt him. I didn't know how to be a father. Nobody taught me. I thought giving him food and a roof was enough." Rachel leaned back slightly. Silence doesn't mean no harm was done. Neglect, lack of care, they can leave deeper wounds than any bruise. Samuel stayed quiet for a moment, then slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red. "He used to look at me like I was his whole world. Now he doesn't look at me at all." Rachel stood up slowly. "Because his world is collapsing, but he still has a chance. And so do you, if you choose differently." As she walked out, the hallway light spilled into the room, followed by a gentle breeze, as if something had quietly shifted. Ryan stood just outside, saying nothing, only resting a hand on her shoulder in silent solidarity. Back in room 214, Grace still sat beside Noah. She gently stroked a lock of hair from his forehead. In deep sleep, his lips moved slightly, as if calling out a name. The lights had dimmed, and only the soft green glow of the heart monitor blinked steadily in the background. "Sleep, Noah," she whispered. "Someone is coming, and this time they're not going to leave you behind." Outside, the wind chime rang softly, and in her heart, a small hope had begun to bloom, like the first green shoot after a long, cruel storm. The sunset cast a faint orange glow along the long corridor of Willow Creek Memorial Hospital, stretching silently across the old white tile floor. Footsteps echoed softly, as if someone was trying not to disturb the stillness that had settled in the building. In room 214, Grace Walker sat on the edge of the bed, a book open in her hands, though her gaze kept returning to the sleeping child. Noah Bennett lay still, his small hands resting gently on his stomach, his eyelids fluttering slightly, as if caught in the fragments of a dream not yet ready to let go. The room was filled with the sharp scent of antiseptic, softened by a faint trace of orange blossom that clung to the scarf Grace always carried from her hair salon. A small bouquet in a glass jar on the windowsill had begun to wilt, but it still tried to release a hint of lavender, as if stubbornly insisting that life had not completely faded away. The door opened slightly, and the light from the hallway crept in timidly. Rachel Monroe leaned in and spoke, her voice melting into the quiet air. "Carolyn just arrived. She's in the hallway, looking a little unsure." Grace closed the book, laid it gently on the bedside table, and stood up with a careful, deliberate movement. She said nothing, simply tilted her head and opened her arms in a quiet, wordless invitation. At the door, a middle-aged woman stepped in with hesitation and uncertainty, as though she had entered a sacred space she wasn't quite ready to face. In her hands was a faded canvas bag worn thin by the years, and a small bottle of orange blossom perfume wrapped in a handkerchief. The light brown cardigan she wore held the warmth of winter's past, steeped in the scent of memory. Her simple shoes were dusty with red clay from the train station, evidence of a hurried journey filled with hope. This was Carolyn Bennett. Carolyn stopped at the doorway, her eyes fixed on the boy. She spoke softly. "Noah?" The boy turned slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of doubt and confusion. He stared at the woman standing there, as if searching for something once familiar that had long been tucked away in forgotten corners of his memory. His lips moved but made no sound. The woman spoke first, her voice low and trembling, as if afraid a single note too loud might shatter the fragile silence between them. "Do you remember me, Noah?" The room thickened with silence so dense it seemed to slow time itself. Carolyn gently twisted the cap off the perfume bottle, her movements careful and reverent. A soft, warm aroma of orange blossom escaped, not sharp but gentle, weaving itself into the air. She sprayed a little onto her wrist, then leaned down and brought her wrist close to the boy's face. "Do you remember this scent? Your mom used to wear it, every night before tucking you in." She whispered the words, her eyes never leaving Noah's, her voice shaking, as if she were reliving a memory buried in dust. Noah blinked several times, then something flickered in his heart, a lullaby from long ago. A warm breath, an arm wrapped around him in a stormy night. Slowly, he sat up, tears welling in his eyes. Without another word, he leaned forward and wrapped his arms around the woman. His thin fingers clutched the scent-warmed fabric. It was the first time since being hospitalized that Noah had willingly touched anyone. Grace stood in the corner, watching every small gesture, then quietly stepped back toward the door, afraid to break the delicate moment. She leaned against the hallway wall, where the last rays of sunlight painted faded scratches across the paint. Through the gap in the door, she watched the scene inside, her hands clenched to her chest, tears falling before she even noticed them. Beside her, Nurse Emily Hayes stepped up and gently placed a hand on Grace's shoulder. "You couldn't save him alone," she said softly. "But without you, we never would have reached Noah's heart." Grace didn't reply. She only nodded slowly. She remembered those early nights when Noah was still lost in fever dreams, whispering over and over, "I'm sorry for being sick. I won't be a bother anymore." Those words had cut deep, and now she could see the wounds beginning to heal, mended not by medicine, but by kindness, listening, and time. In the quiet room, Carolyn sat down in the chair beside the bed. She took Noah's hand and began to tell stories. Old memories, small details only a relative would know. The boy didn't say much, only nodded or whispered short replies, but his eyes were no longer distant. He played gently with her fingers, like a child rediscovering a place he once belonged. Rachel returned carrying a cup of steaming herbal tea. She handed it to Grace and said in a whisper, as if not to disturb the calm that had settled around them, "Carolyn will stay a few days. We arranged a room for her just down the hall." Grace took the cup in both hands, holding it like a fragile gift of warmth. She smiled, her eyes still fixed on the door. "Thank you. Noah needs her. But I'll stay too, at least until he can smile. A real smile, without an apology behind it." In the corridor, the last of the evening sun faded, giving way to the pale glow of hospital lights. A janitor moved quietly across the floor, each motion slow and deliberate, as if afraid to disturb something sacred left behind in the room. And in that room, amid the faint scent of orange blossom, the trace of alcohol and quiet voices without words, something warm and alive had just returned in time. The late afternoon light slanted through the frosted hospital window, casting a thin veil of gold across the white tiled floor. The steady footsteps of nurses echoed down the hallway, mingling with the faint scent of antiseptics lingering in the air. A food cart rolled slowly along, its wheels squeaking softly each time it stopped outside a patient's room. Room 214 remained lit. Noah Bennett sat curled up on the hospital bed, arms wrapped tightly around his knees as if trying to shield himself from the chill of the fading day. Old scars marked his arms, some fading, others still etched clearly into his dry skin. His hair had been cut short a few days earlier, exposing patches of healing skin on his scalp where the inflammation had begun to subside. Beside the bed, a small table under the window held a tray of cold food. Half a box of rice, wilted vegetables, and a small plastic cup with only a thin layer of caramel left at the bottom. Outside, the changing season's breeze whistled through the window frame, producing soft creaks like fading footsteps down a long corridor. The smell of rubbing alcohol and disinfectant still lingered, but the strongest presence in the room was silence. A silence thick between breaths, stretched between hope and fear. The door creaked open gently. A woman entered, not in a white coat, but wearing a light brown sweater, her hair tied back in a neat bun. She smiled and slowly sat down on the floor, facing the boy. Not too close, not too far. Her every move was quiet, as if afraid to disturb the fragile stillness in the room. "Hi there, my name is Claire. I just want to sit here with you for a little while, if that's okay." Noah nodded faintly, eyes still cast down at his bare feet. He wore a pair of worn wool socks with frayed heels. After a moment, he glanced at her, then quickly looked away again, his gaze guarded. "I'm not a doctor, and I don't give shots. I'm just here to listen. If you don't want to say anything, that's perfectly fine." Claire didn't touch the bed or place anything on it. She simply sat still, hands resting on her lap, eyes gently focused on him. The air between them was like still water waiting to ripple. Sounds from outside, metal instruments clinking, a child crying faintly from another room began to fade into the background. 1 minute passed, then another. Finally, Noah spoke, his voice soft as wind brushing over water. "Yesterday, I ate the pudding when Miss Grace stepped out. I couldn't wait. I thought, if she came back and saw I ate it without asking, she'd get mad. Maybe she wouldn't come back." Claire tilted her head gently, her voice smooth and warm like thread sliding across a palm. And you were afraid that eating the pudding without asking would make her leave? He didn't answer right away. After a pause, he nodded slightly, eyes still fixed on his hands. I thought, grown-ups leave if I mess up. If I don't get things right, if I make them tired, they disappear. Claire exhaled slowly. Sweetheart, pudding is meant to be eaten. When you're hungry, you have the right to eat. No one should ever make you feel guilty for that. You don't need permission just to exist. Noah was quiet for a long time. Then he looked up at her. For the first time, his eyes were no longer hidden behind a wall. In them was a quiet storm waiting to pass, a flicker of doubt turning into the beginning of trust. Do you think I'm a burden? Claire didn't reply immediately. She quietly took a folded slip of paper from her coat pocket, and on it she wrote, not just one word, but a sentence in soft, round handwriting. You are not a burden, you are light. She handed it to him without saying anything more. Noah took the paper, his fingers trembling slightly. He read the words slowly, as if it was the first time in his life someone had written something just for him. He held on to that piece of paper for a long time, as if it were the first thing he ever believed truly belonged to him. When Carolyn entered with an old sketchbook in her hands, she paused upon seeing that look in his eyes. No one spoke. Only the heart monitor clicked softly in the background, marking each steady beat. Grace returned in the late afternoon, holding a neatly folded paper bag. Its edge creased as though it had been gripped tightly the whole way. She stepped inside quietly, didn't knock, and didn't ask the usual questions like, did you finish your meal or does it still hurt? She simply placed the bag on the table, tilted her head slightly toward Noah, and smiled. I walked past the bookstore and saw this box of crayons sitting in the brightest spot. For some reason, I thought of you right away. Noah looked at the bag, then at Grace, as if to confirm that this wasn't a reward but just a gift, without strings. He smiled, just a little. Can I draw? Grace nodded. Of course, no one's stopping you. For nearly an hour, they didn't speak much. Noah drew with focus, while Carolyn sat beside him, gently rubbing his back now and then. On the paper, a small house began to take shape, with a red roof, 2 cats sunbathing, a cozy armchair, and a curly-haired woman giving a laughing child a haircut. At the bottom, he slowly wrote in wobbly block letters, "Thank you, Miss Grace. When I was scared the most, you stayed." Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and smiled. I told you, I'm not going anywhere. Noah set down his crayon and turned to Carolyn. I don't have to say sorry for eating pudding anymore, do I? Carolyn crouched to his eye level, resting her hand gently on his shoulder, offering reassurance without words. Never, Noah, and you never have to apologize for being yourself. Being a child is never wrong. Outside, the last golden light of day touched the edge of the leaves, then disappeared behind the old trees standing sentinel over the sunset. On the misty hospital window, that pale glow stretched like a quiet lullaby across the small room that remained lit inside. A room where Noah was coming back to life, not just through medicine and bandages, but through something far more delicate. An unjudging gaze, a hand on his shoulder, a drawing that didn't need to be perfect, and a cup of pudding he was allowed to eat without asking. Things adults might call trivial, yet they were stitching back the torn pieces of a child who had only just escaped the shadows of fear. The afternoon sun slanted through the stained glass windows of Willow Creek Town Hall, casting diagonal streaks of light across the worn wooden floor. The air in the room seemed steeped in time, tinged with the scent of old varnish, fresh flowers, and a faint trace of perfume from the arriving guests. Outside, an ancient oak whispered in the early summer breeze, its leaves rustling as if sharing secrets with the ground below. Across the street, the wind chime hanging from a cafe awning tinkled gently, its soft song enough to quiet the heart. Rows of antique wooden chairs were lined up neatly, each one appearing to hold a memory of its own. Burgundy velvet cloths draped over every seat, soft and elegant, reminiscent of ceremonial gatherings from decades past. The golden light from the ceiling chandeliers spilled onto the floor like warm honey, infusing the space with a sense of both solemnity and comfort. In the back left corner, a small acoustic band played. A wooden guitar, a violin, and a cajon came together to create music that was humble and soothing. The sound wasn't loud. It drifted like a breeze beneath a quiet rooftop, filling in the unspoken spaces between rows. A gentle ballad from the violin stirred a few older guests to tilt their heads, as if hearing something long forgotten returned for a moment. Grace Walker sat quietly in the last row near the wall, as much a part of the setting as the chairs and the wood-paneled walls. She wore a simple black dress, her hair pinned low, no makeup or jewelry, only a gaze that carried something unnamed. Sitting beside her, Nurse Emily Hayes leaned in and whispered, "Grace, you should look up. They're about to call your name." Grace gave a faint smile, saying nothing. From a few rows ahead, Carolyn Bennett turned back and gave her an encouraging look. She said nothing aloud, but Grace knew that if she didn't walk onto that stage today, she wouldn't just be skipping a ceremony. She would be turning away from everything that had happened. Further down, Noah Bennett sat beside Carolyn. He wore a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly combed, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. A slim manila folder rested on his knees. He stared at the stage as if waiting for something far greater than a prize. "The Courageous Citizen Award this year," announced the host, a man in his 50s with a warm, resonant voice, "goes to a woman who isn't a doctor, a police officer, or a social worker. She holds a pair of scissors, but not just to cut hair. She held the heart of a child in pain, and she did not stay silent." Grace heard the applause begin, slow and steady, then growing like a wave. She took a deep breath, rose to her feet, and walked step by step toward the stage. The eyes on her weren't drawn by glamour, but by something quieter, a kind of courage that never asks for attention. As she stepped onto the wooden platform, her knees trembled slightly, but her heart remained strangely calm. On stage, the host moved aside, nodding respectfully and extending his hand. Grace shook it with a slow, humble gesture. She didn't look around for familiar faces or scan the crowd. Her eyes went straight to the microphone, as if that was the only place that mattered. The overhead lights weren't blinding, just enough to cast her shadow against the backdrop, like it too had a story to tell. The room fell into a hush, the kind that comes when no one dares to interrupt what's about to be spoken. She didn't read from the folded paper in her hand. Instead, she looked straight ahead, toward the front row where Noah sat, eyes wide, his small smile barely formed but unmistakable. "I'm Grace," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I run a hair salon on Main Street. That day, I didn't mean to save anyone. I was just going to tidy up the shop, see a few clients, and finish an ordinary day. But then a boy walked in. He didn't say much, didn't complain. He was so silent it made me listen." She paused. Not a phone moved, not a whisper stirred the air, only her voice remained. "I kept wondering if I didn't speak up, would anyone else? If I had just done my job and looked away, ignored what felt wrong, that boy might not be sitting there today with that smile." Sometimes courage isn't about big heroic acts. It's about opening your heart, facing what feels wrong, and refusing to look away when someone needs to be seen. She stopped. Somewhere in the crowd, someone nodded. An elderly woman dabbed her eyes. A nurse in a pale blue uniform squeezed the hand of her colleague. At that moment, Noah stood from his seat and made his way slowly up to the stage. He still clutched the folder. Carolyn gently touched his shoulder as if to encourage him. Grace stepped back, giving him room. Noah said nothing. He simply handed her a drawing. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. It showed a woman standing in the center of a hair salon, holding a pair of scissors surrounded by a warm yellow glow. In the mirror behind her, a smiling boy looked back. In the bottom corner, in messy but heartfelt handwriting, were the words, "Thank you, Miss Grace, for not leaving me alone." Grace brought her hand to her mouth, eyes filling with tears. The room went silent once again. "You were the one who taught me what courage really is," she said to Noah, her voice breaking, though no tears fell. The entire hall rose to its feet. The applause this time wasn't just for her, but for the truth that in a world full of indifference, some hearts still refuse to stay silent. After the ceremony ended and the room emptied, Grace remained seated in the front row, the drawing resting on her lap. Noah came and sat beside her. He didn't say anything. He simply leaned his head against her shoulder. "You were so brave today," Grace whispered. The boy smiled. "I learned from you." Outside, the last rays of sunlight stretched across the wooden steps and settled gently on their shoulders. A woman who once thought she was just a hairdresser, and a boy who once believed no one would ever truly hear him. The morning didn't begin with birdsong or sunlight pouring through the window, but with the sound of wind slipping through the old roof tiles, whispering like a sigh from a house just waking after a long, dream-filled night. On the porch, dew from the night before dripped onto a pot of lavender just beginning to bloom in soft purple. The scent of damp air, mixed with the earthy aroma of post-rain soil, seeped through every crack in the wooden walls, settling into the air as if this place had never known the rush of time. In the kitchen, the kettle hissed quietly like a sleeping cat's breath. Carolyn stood at the windowsill, gazing out into the small backyard garden. She didn't care for her plants by schedule, but by instinct. If one drooped, she watered it. If another bloomed, she admired it. She never checked the forecast but read the sky. It was a habit passed down from her mother, a woman who planted things the way she planted hope. At the end of the hallway, a soft golden light spilled from a small room. Noah was already awake. He usually stirred before sunrise, not because of nightmares, but because restful sleep had never come easy. Lately, though, his early mornings no longer came with shaking or tears. He would just sit in silence, like today. One arm wrapped around a pillow, the other holding a pencil that tapped gently against a blank page. Mateo, the white cat with pale turquoise eyes, leapt onto the table, pacing slowly as if he too understood that every movement in this room needed to be tender. Noah didn't shoo him away, he only murmured, "Mateo, careful. Don't touch the watercolors I just mixed." Mateo folded his ears back and curled into a fluffy white ball, breathing evenly. Noah turned back to his sketchbook. On the page was a long hallway in shades of soft gray. At the end of it, the silhouette of a woman walked forward, her coat trailing silently behind her. Next to her, a child clung to the edge of her coat, head bowed. But in the gentle light ahead, it was clear the boy's eyes were open, looking forward, not back. In soft pencil, with a slightly wobbly hand, he wrote, "Those who don't stay silent." When Carolyn opened the door, a tray of tea and a warm plate of pastries in hand, Noah was still staring at the drawing. She didn't speak. She simply set the tray down gently, then sat at the edge of the bed, her eyes drifting to the garden outside the slightly open window. A few moments passed. Then the boy asked, his voice low and hoarse from not speaking all morning, "Aunt Carolyn, can I hang this drawing up?" She turned to him, unsurprised. She knew the moment was coming when Noah would need something to mark the line between before and from now on. She looked at the picture, at the words he had written, and nodded slowly. "Where do you want to hang it?" Noah pointed to the wall beside his desk, where morning sunlight filtered in every day, a spot he could see from bed as soon as he opened his eyes. "Right there. So I can remember every day that someone once heard me speak." Carolyn said nothing more. She stood, got some tape, and helped him hang the drawing. Straight, careful. When they were done, they both sat and stared at it for a long while, neither one breaking the gentle silence that had settled over the room. That afternoon, Carolyn went out to prune the rosemary. Noah sat on the steps, working on a new drawing. Rosita, the plump orange cat, lazed under his feet, occasionally shifting to remind him the world was still there. A sparrow landed on the railing, chirping softly. Noah paused, watching it for a long time. He had once drawn birds trapped in cages, but today this one flew away before he could even lift his pencil. He didn't feel sad, he just smiled, then went back to sketching the sunlight. Carolyn returned holding an envelope. "There's a letter from Miss Grace, from Willow Creek." Noah carefully opened it. Inside was a small card with Grace's slightly slanted handwriting. "I just gave a haircut to a grumpy old man who wouldn't let anyone touch behind his ears. I had to tell him about you, a brave little boy who used to flinch too, but was braver than anyone I've ever met. How have you been? I hung your drawing right behind the counter. Everyone who walks in sees it." Noah looked up, his eyes shining with a joy he couldn't quite put into words. He whispered, "I'll draw her a new picture, one with light and with Matteo and Rosita sleeping and the sound of scissors snipping in the salon." Late afternoon. The sunlight slowly slipped past the edge of the window, leaving a soft golden hue on the table. Noah finished hanging his new drawing, then turned to look at her. "And Carolyn," he said softly. Carolyn was reading a book and didn't look up. "I don't have to say sorry for being in pain anymore, do I?" She set the book down on her lap, not answering right away. A breeze drifted in through the open window, carrying the scent of mint and pine resin. After a long pause, she finally replied, her voice steady and low, just loud enough for him to hear. "That's right. Here, you don't have to apologize for being a child." Noah said nothing else. He lay down on the bed, pulled the blanket up to his chest, closed his eyes, and let a faint smile curve across his lips. That night, in a small room with a window facing the garden, a child slept peacefully. No nightmares, no fear. Outside the door, 2 cats kept watch, the moonlight casting a quiet glow through the glass. The drawing still hung on the wall, its words bold and clear, "Those who don't stay silent." And somewhere in this life, there are still people like Grace, like Carolyn. People who don't walk past someone else's pain in silence. People who hear the faintest whispers from children who once believed they weren't worth listening to. Maybe the most powerful moment in this entire story isn't the punishment of a neglectful father, but the second Noah understood something simple and life-changing. I don't have to say sorry for being in pain anymore. It's such a small sentence, yet enough to move even the most hardened heart. In this world, cruelty doesn't always shout. Sometimes it's the cold silence when a child needs to be held, and kindness doesn't always need to be grand. Sometimes it just takes one person who chooses not to turn away, like Grace once did. Today's story is proof of a simple but profound truth. Those who abandon others will be removed from the lives of those who deserve love, and those who stay, even if they're just an ordinary hairdresser, will be remembered forever because they didn't stay silent. And you, what about you? Have you ever met someone who made you feel like it was okay to be vulnerable? Have you ever wished someone had spoken up for you sooner? Or perhaps, were you the one who spoke up for someone else? If you're a mom, a sister, or simply a woman who has silently carried the weight of others, today I want to send you my warmest greetings. How are you doing? Have you taken care of yourself lately? Please share your thoughts below, because here we don't just tell stories, we listen. And maybe, just maybe, your voice could give someone else the strength to finally stop staying silent. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Thank you for staying with us until the very end.